The Pat McAfee era at ESPN appears to be just beginning somehow, even though it is going on 3 years old, Ben. College GameDay, of course, his most, the most ESPN of his responsibilities. And since Lee Corso retired in week 1 of this season, we have seen McAfee fully take over as the star of the long-running college football studio show. Ben, we have speculated for a while about what would happen when Corso left. We've talked about McAfee's reign on game day as long as we've been doing this show, but for the past month or so, we finally gotten to see it put into practice, like what this show will actually look like with Pat McAfee at its center. What have you thought? What has stood out to you as far as how he has really, been the peacock opening up his feathers in the post-Corso era?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I think what stood out to me is how much restraint he was apparently showing these last few years before we got to this point, because obviously, Pat's not a guy when he's a part of a show or in any sort of spotlight to be quiet. He's always pretty loud, pretty vocal, but you've really seen him take over that Corso role. I think I said after we did our first episode after Lee Corso's retirement that they were kind of replacing him in the aggregate with Pat McAfee and Nick Saban. McAfee bringing kind of like the lighthearted role, and Saban obviously bringing the coach's perspective. Watching on Saturday, watching that show from Miami, it felt like a 1-to-1. Like it felt like, okay, this is Pat McAfee in the Lee Corso role. Like this is how this show is going to be moving forward. Obviously capping off with the Speedo jump from the top of the diving board. So I think that this is now like Pat McAfee is fully entrenched. I think this is his role. I think in many ways it's his show, and he is kind of the headliner of this show now moving forward. And it's been really interesting to see, even for somebody who was still a big part of this show for the last 3 or 4 years, to as you put it, kind of a peacock spreading his wings here and really showing what he's capable of.
So there was also this conversation that Pat filmed and then posted, which, whatever. The kids are probably going to make fun of the earnestness of something like that. I didn't mind that. It's a legendary dude showing you genuine appreciation. It was an inbound phone call. It's not like Pat staged the whole thing. And it was Lee calling to, having just watched the high dive off of the University of Miami, Olympic diving stand, telling him, fantastic work, and like you get it, basically. That's kind of what I took Lee's words to mean, Pat. And he said, I called you Pat, Ben, but I think like that. Yeah, you can have it if you want. It felt like to me, he said, like, I couldn't have passed the torch to a better person. That's as straightforward as it is. Like, if Lee Corso's telling you he passed the torch to Pat McAfee, then that's what this show is going to be. And in a way, I think the similarities are natural, right? Like, I think that Pat gets the spirit. I think his shtick has always worked best on this show and on WWE, in my personal opinion. Because I think he has a way with the crowd. He gets the spirit and the culture of college football in a way that you have to if you're going to be able to be the face of a show like this. And I think he's willing to embrace the entertainment side of a 3-hour, what could be a pretty boring and monotonous show if in the wrong hands. Like he is not afraid to do stuff exactly like this in order to get the blood flowing and have those moments that stand out.
Would it feel sacrilegious if he started doing the mascot head now? Because that phone call made me think like it's in play that they could unretire the mascot head and Pat McAfee could do it.
I don't have an affinity for that in a way that I'm going to be the one to say it's sacrilegious or you can't ever do it or anything. But what I was kind of heading toward there is like, I don't think they need it. Like, I think, and what's been interesting about the way that Pat is filled in, I would say, is that it hasn't been one thing. They didn't say, here's our headgear pick. They basically just said, Pat's going to do Pat. Week to week, that might look different, but that's going to be what the show is kind of building toward or built around, or, just that's going to be what the viewer takes away is a Pat moment. And in one case, like after the Charlie Kirk shooting, it was the opener of the show was kind of the moment that stuck with the audience, I would say, and kind of went viral that weekend, was him bringing the Tennessee chant in with the moment of honor, in with this kind of hype, like locker room speech to bring, kind of galvanize the people there, the people watching at home, the crew there, whatever it might have been. Like, it's kind of a lot of responsibility for Pat, but I don't think that they need to do one thing to have him shine. He's clearly proving like he can kind of wing it week to week, and it's going to work.
Yeah, you have the field goal kicking segment too, which I know we briefly discussed as like a potential possibility to end the show. And I think we all agreed that the idea of a college student whiffing on a field goal probably isn't the most upbeat approach to end that show, but it is kind of become the signature segment of the show post mascot head. And then you also have whatever he does at the end. It seems like it's going to be some sort of, very homerific, very embracing of the crowd that they have there. I'm in a group chat with like a bunch of Miami Hurricanes fans. The way they responded to Saturday, like that was, I can't recall that. And I'm somebody who's also in a bunch of group chats with Ohio State fans. And I don't know, like, if we've all become jaded to this kind of stuff, but like, I don't recall this sort of enthusiasm for Lee Corso in recent years, the way that we've gotten it from Pat McAfee in the last few weeks alone. So you kind of touched on it. I mean, that's having covered Pat now for 2 years here at Awful Announcing, the two things that I'm the biggest fan of his work are WWE and College GameDay. I think those are the two best vehicles to showcase his personality. And I think that has certainly bared out in these last 3 weeks post Lee Corso with the way he's taken on this role.
The one difference that I want to bounce off of you and I guess the audience is when Lee Corso was the centerpiece of this show, which, in all honesty, if we're looking back to a point where we could have fully said that and had it be true, it's 15 years ago now. But when that was the case, I would say that Corso kind of channeled the spirit of college football through himself and kind of enmeshed himself into it. Whereas I would say Pat, and I truly, like, this sounds critical because it's Pat McAfee and there's no way to talk about elements of who he is without it sounding like a knock. But I just am saying this. With Pat, I feel like he kind of sucks up all that culture and like sits atop it. And it's like, I am college football today. Watch me, versus Lee was like, I am inside of college football. Watch us celebrate this, and I think that is just a very different type of show. As we get further into it, I think we'll feel that. And yet, like, it almost kind of circles me back, Ben, to the way that Lee Corso was such a unicorn and to still be standing on ESPN, why the goodbye was so powerful, which is like, he's kind of a vestige of an old ESPN where that was what it was. ESPN today is what I just described with Pat. It is kind of hear me roar, watch me, and I'll come, delight you and piss you off and thrill you and surprise you for a few hours to accompany the sports you're watching. So it makes sense. It's just going to feel different.
No, I think that's a very astute observation. I think obviously Pat has a lot more public ego than Lee Corso had, especially toward the end of his run. He has a lot more bravado. He's a lot more in your face with just all of his everything he does. And so it's definitely a different type of energy. I think it probably more accurately reflects the modern sports fan than Lee Corso did in 2025, whatever that says about the state of society and the state of sports. But I think it is, you can't say it's not connecting with the audience, because I think it certainly is. But yeah, it's one of those things where it feels like, because Pat does this thing where every year it feels like he threatens to leave College Game Day. And it almost feels like Pat would be tougher to replace at this point than Lee Corso would, because I think Pat is such kind of a one-of-one talent in today's sports media age. In
any media age ever. I think that's the thing you can't ever drive home enough with Pat McAfee is, like him, hate him, whatever, he does things no one else could ever pull off, which is why I think ESPN wants to keep him around. We heard via Richard Deitch of The Athletic in a yet-to-be-released, very heavily and impressively milked interview, Ben, with Burke Magnus, the content head over at ESPN, that they, unsurprisingly, would like to keep Pat McAfee around. But I thought the quote about it was more revealing than the general idea of keeping a star talent in the building. Burke reportedly said, on an ongoing basis, beyond the current relationship we have with him, they'd love to keep him around. No doubt about that, 100%. His show's hitting on all cylinders. He's an incredible interviewer and conversationalist, a validation for athletes and executives to be on his show. Every commissioner wants to be on his show. Every athlete wants to be on the show. There's a cool factor, a relevance factor, funny, and entertaining. And he said, in closing, as we sit here today, I could not imagine our daytime schedule without his show. Again, that's Burke Magnus of ESPN. So, Ben, Pat's original deal was for 5 years. That started back in 2023. So we're not even halfway through it. I mean, I don't know the exact month, but let's just say we're 2 years into it. Like I said, not surprising that ESPN would want to keep Pat McAfee around. We just had a whole conversation about why he's the fulcrum and an irreplaceable part of one of its biggest shows. Obviously, he spends the majority of his time hosting a 2-3 hour program on their midday lineup. But it's funny to me, I as much as I just said that Game Day is becoming the McAfee show more and more, I actually think that McAfee's value to ESPN on the Pat McAfee show almost is less about him. And it's about the other ways that he kind of has helped develop their stable and contribute the interviews that Magnus hits on there. What do you see for the next few years of McAfee at ESPN? Because when he started, we were writing columns about, is this tenable? Is he going to step in it? Can they stomach what he's bringing to the table? Those questions have been answered. There hasn't been a controversy in a while, and now Burke's on the record being as effusive as ever could be, saying, we want Pat for as long as he'll be here. What do you think that's going to look like?
Yeah, as recently as months ago, we were writing about is this still tenable? There was all the stuff when they added Rich Eisen and Pat was, saying and tweeting cryptic things, hashtag up to something season. There's always been this kind of push and pull with that show and its future on ESPN. I know, we frequent the Reddits, and there are a lot of people on the Pat McAfee Reddit who don't think that show, at least as recently as a few months ago, they didn't think it was long for ESPN. But the thing that I always come back to is, say what you will about Pat, say what you will about his fit on ESPN, he has gotten their full support. I mean, you said there hasn't been a controversy in a while. There have been controversies. I know this was, almost 2 years ago at this point, but you had the Jimmy Kimmel thing. Earlier this year, you had the Mary Kay Cornett thing. Yeah, true. Yeah, valid.
Yeah, the Mary Kay Cornett is definitely good to hit, because that could have been ugly, but the way ESPN allowed him to handle it on his own terms, I think is as loud of a signal as this interview was as to their support for him.
You had him calling out Norby Williamson, and the end result there, regardless of what role it played in it, was Norby Williamson leaving ESPN. You had him calling out executives earlier this year when Andrew Marchand had his report about Adam Schefter being shadow banned from his show. You had that whole there's been stuff in the whole the one through line has been he's had ESPN's full support. He's never been pulled off air. He's never been punished as far as we know. I know they've had conversations, obviously, as one would expect, but it's it seems like it's been with ESPN's full support. So to me, like what Burke Magnus said is interesting, and it's mostly interesting because it just matches their actions. It's that he has had their full support. I think, we've talked about cornerstone talents for ESPN, obviously Stephen A. Smith, Mike Greenberg. I think Peter Schrager is starting to get into that conversation since he joined ESPN. And I think Pat McAfee is clearly one of those cornerstone talents. And it's interesting because he still licenses his show. He still owns his show. And I think that's still one of the more unique aspects of the ESPN Pat McAfee relationship. But like, there's no reason, as much as, Pat can stir the pot, there's no reason to think he hasn't done so without the full support of ESPN behind him.
Just to reiterate what I was kind of getting at in terms of that, I think his value on his daytime show is less about some kind of big monologue he might go on. Not that he doesn't cut through when he wants to, but you just think about like some of the standout stuff that I think he's put together over there. The college football playoff altcasts, I think, are actually very good. I know that there's always a little bit of a barrier to entry. Those things aren't ever going to be at the level of the actual game broadcast, but I think that they're the best of that variety that I've ever watched. Ty Schmidt, his Packers fan, Iowa fan producer, co-hosts Adam Schefter's podcast. Darius Butler is on the early morning pregame show on ESPN, NFL Matchup, which I think it might be only on digital now. I think that, frankly, the reps, we've talked a lot about how the pipeline's kind of going away at ESPN, where it's like, unless you're already at a level where you fit on First Take or, have your own podcast, like it's just harder to break in. I think not that these people broke in with Pat, but like people like Heather Dinich, I think or Dinich do great there. I think Shams Charania is at his best on Pat's show, and he's been a little bit of an awkward fit at ESPN so far. People like PK Subban and a number of the former athlete types go on there, and they look better than ever. And then the interviews, like no one's getting the interviews Pat's getting. And so just to kind of, I think, like balance, yes, the controversies are there. Why does ESPN want to keep this guy? Setting aside his just, okay, he's popular, great. Like what value is he providing? I think it's all of that stuff that maybe doesn't go as noticed as just, the time he gets mad at Anthony Richardson and rips him a new one when he goes to the sideline last year or whatever other thing you want to point to. But like to circle back on your first point, Ben, it's going to be, the ball's in Pat's court. It always has been, just by the nature of this business partnership. It's a licensing agreement. The minute Pat doesn't want his show to appear on ESPN, it's not going to. But it feels like this has actually gone better than you would have thought if you would rewind it 18 months ago.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great point about using it as a pipeline. I would throw, you've made this point before. It's like the part in my take test, right? And so this has become, are you a good hang? Can you hang on Pat's show and just like be normal? And I would throw like Dan Orlovsky in there. And it's like, if you remember like Dan Orlovsky's reputation before he started going on McAfee, it's like, okay, he's this like kind of, I mean, he leans into hot takes. He's very quarterback obsessed. He has weird food habits, but then he goes on McAfee, once or twice a week and shows a whole different side of himself. And he can roll with the punches with those guys. It humanizes him to a different level. I think Heather Dinich is a great shout. It raises her profile. I think, I think it's been a great pipeline for ESPN. And that is like, there hasn't really been a whole lot of synergy other than College Game Day between McAfee and ESPN. That's been the one place where they have had synergy and there's still, some weird stuff like how often Ian Rappaport goes on, although that will be less weird now that the ESPN's going to own the NFL network. But it's definitely, I agree. I think it's gone better than I would have imagined. And not just because it's still on air. And I think actually, like, as much as we shit on ESPN at times, as much as everybody shits on ESPN, like they deserve credit, because the only way this was going to work is if they just gave Pat their full endorsement and full support. Otherwise, this would have blown up at any one of the number of controversies we mentioned earlier.
It's the type of, it's the exact reason people had skepticism when McAfee walked out there with, I think, Bob Iger to announce this at like the Disney upfronts almost 3 years ago now, which people are like, they're not going to let Pat be Pat. And for better or worse, and plenty of people could make a credible argument for worse, and I wouldn't necessarily tell you you're wrong, like they have, and they've benefited from it.